Hello, Indian Creek 8th grade students. This is Mr. Roush with the second video for our Reconstruction series. Part 2 is Radicals in Control. Now our guiding question is going to be, how were the Radical Republicans able to put their version of Reconstruction into action? So throughout this video, start thinking about some answers to this question. Now during the fall of 1865, the Southern states created new governments that met the rules President Johnson laid down, and Southern voters elected new representatives to Congress. More than 24 of these representatives had been high-ranking officials in the Confederacy, including the Confederacy's Vice President, Alexander H. Stephens. This was a problem with many of the radical Republicans. When the elected officials came to Washington, D.C., Congress refused to seat them. They claimed that the treatment of African Americans was not improving, and they refused to readmit the Southern states on such easy terms and rejected Johnson's claim that Reconstruction was complete. So one of the big problems with the Southern states was black codes. Black codes were laws passed in 1865, and that aimed to control freed men and women. Some of the examples of black codes were: it banned African Americans from owning or renting farms. It allowed whites to take orphaned African American children as unpaid apprentices, which was basically using them as slaves. And it also allowed local officials to arrest and fine unemployed African Americans and make them work for white employers. For the Southern states, they aimed to control freed men and women and enable plantation owners to exploit African American workers. But for the Northerners, they saw it as slavery in disguise. So the Northerners had to change up the justice system. The Freedmen's Bureau had the authority to set up special courts to prosecute individuals charged with violating the rights of African Americans, and this provided the African Americans with a form of justice. They also set up the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted full citizenship to African Americans. It overturned the black codes. It also contradicted the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which was from the last chapter. We learned that it had ruled that African Americans were not citizens, but this overruled that, and now African Americans were seen as citizens. Andrew Johnson didn't really like any of these new laws that were going into effect with the Radical Republicans, so his actions were to veto the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act. He felt that the government was overstepping its proper authority. He also said that the laws were unconstitutional because they were passed by a Congress that did not include representatives from all states. By raising the issue of representation, Johnson indirectly threatened to veto any law passed by this Congress. So the Congress fires back. Republicans in Congress had enough vetoes to override or defeat both vetoes, and the bills became law. As the split between Congress and the President grew, the possibility of their working together faded. The Radical Republicans abandoned the idea of compromise and drafted a new Reconstruction plan, led by the Radical Republicans. Congress wanted to ensure that African Americans would not lose the rights that the Civil Rights Act granted. Fearing it might be challenged and overturned, Congress, in June of 1866, passed a new amendment to the Constitution, which is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment granted full citizenship to all individuals born in the United States. It also stated that no state could take away a citizen's life, liberty, and property without due process of the law. And also, every citizen was entitled to equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment also barred prominent former Confederates from holding national or state office unless pardoned by a vote of 2/3 by Congress. It also did not include the Native Americans. The Native Americans were not considered citizens until 1924. The South reacted to the 14th Amendment. The states were forced to ratify the amendment in order to be readmitted into the Union. Of the 11 states, Tennessee was the only one that ratified the 14th Amendment, which delayed its adoption until 1968. The 14th Amendment became a major issue in the congressional elections of 1866. Johnson urged northern and southern state legislators to reject it. He also campaigned vigorously against Republican candidates. Many Northerners were disturbed by the nastiness of Johnson's campaign. They also worried about the violent clashes between whites and African Americans, such as the riots that erupted in Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana. So the results of the election is a majority of the Republicans won. They increased their numbers in both houses and Congress. They gained control of governments in every northern state, and this gave Congress the ability to take Reconstruction into their own hands. The Republicans in Congress quickly took charge of Reconstruction. Most radicals agreed with Congressman James Garfield of Ohio that, quote, "we must compel obedience in the Union and demand protection for its humblest citizens." President Johnson could do little to stop them because Congress could easily override his vetoes. Thus began a period known as Radical Reconstruction. On March 2, 1867, Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act. This act called for the creation of a new government in the 10 southern states that had not ratified the 14th Amendment. What they would do is divide the 10 states into 5 military districts. Each district was placed under a military commander until the new governments were formed. They also guaranteed African Americans the right to vote, and this prevented former Confederate leaders from holding office like they were trying to do when Johnson was trying to have his Reconstruction plan. So here's a map of the 5 military districts. We had Virginia up here was number 1. Number 2 was North Carolina and South Carolina. 3 was Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. Then 4 we had Mississippi and Arkansas. And 5 was Louisiana and Texas. To gain readmission into the Union, states had to ratify the 14th Amendment. They also had to submit a new state constitution to Congress. And a few weeks later, the Second Reconstruction Act was passed, which required military commanders to register voters and prepare for new state constitutional conventions. Many white Southerners refused to take part in the elections for constitutional conventions and state governments. Thousands of newly registered African American voters did use their right to vote. In the elections, Republicans gained control of Southern state governments. By 1868, 7 of the Southern states, including Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina, had established new governments and met the conditions for readmission to the Union. By 1870, Mississippi, Virginia, and Texas were restored to the Union. Johnson was strongly opposed to radical Reconstruction, but he still had the power as Commander-in-Chief of the Army to direct the actions of the military governors. For this reason, Congress passed several laws to limit the president's power. One of the laws was the Tenure of Office Act. This prohibited the president from removing government officials without approval of the Senate. This includes members of his own cabinet. The act also violated the tradition that presidents controlled their cabinets, and it threatened the presidential power. The conflict between Johnson and the radicals grew even more intense. In August of 1867, when Congress was not in session, Johnson suspended Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without the Senate's approval. When the Senate met again and refused to approve the suspension, Johnson just removed Stanton from office, a deliberate violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson angered the Republicans further by appointing some generals the radicals opposed as commanders of southern military districts. The House of Representatives were outraged and voted to impeach, or formally charge with wrongdoing, the president. The House accused Johnson of misconduct and sent the case to Senate for trial. The trial lasted 3 months, and Johnson's defenders claimed that the president was exercising his right to challenge the laws he deemed unconstitutional. Johnson's defenders also stated that the impeachment was politically motivated and contrary to the spirit of the Constitution. Samuel J. Tilden, a Democrat from New York, claimed that Congress was trying to remove the president from an office without accusing him of a crime, or anything more than a mere difference of opinion. Johnson's accusers argued that Congress should retain the supreme power to make the laws. In May, as the nation waited anxiously, the senators cast their votes. The votes were 35 to 19 to convict the president, which was just one vote short of the two-thirds majority. Several of the moderate Republicans voted for a verdict of not guilty because they did not believe a president should be removed from office for political differences. As a result, Johnson stayed in office until the end of his term in March of 1869. By the presidential election of 1868, most Southern states had rejoined the Union. Many Americans hoped that conflicts over Reconstruction and sectional divisions were behind them. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected. He beat the former governor from New York, Horatio Seymour. He won with 214 of the 294 electoral votes. The 1868 election was a vote on Reconstruction, and the voters supported the Republican approach. After the election, Republicans developed their last major piece of Reconstruction legislation. In February of 1869, Congress passed the 15th Amendment. It prohibited the state and federal governments from denying the right to vote to any male citizen because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. African American men won the right to vote when the 15th Amendment was ratified and became law in February of 1870. Republicans thought that the power of the ballot would enable African Americans to protect themselves. That belief, it turned out, was too optimistic. Well, that's all we have for today. Thanks for watching, and tune in for part 3 and 4 of Reconstruction. Have a great day.